Welcome to the School of Nursing's inaugural Planetary Health guest lectureship. My name is Teddy Potter, and I am Director of Planetary Health for the School of Nursing. Before we begin, we want to thank our co-sponsors, the Bell Museum, the Circle of Indigenous Nations, the Earl E. Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing, the Institute on the Environment, the Office for Equity and Diversity, and the Office for Public Engagement. If you have questions for the speaker, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom panel. At the end of the talk, there will be a brief time for questions and answers. A link to the lecture will be recorded and be available on the School of Nursing's Planetary Health webpage following today's event. Now let us begin.
We acknowledge that the School of Nursing at the Twin Cities campus of the University of Minnesota is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. We recognize the long-standing relationship between the land and the Dakota people, the traditional stewards of this land. We also acknowledge the violence of colonialism and ongoing racism toward Indigenous people. We are also growing in our realization that the healthcare system meant to protect and heal the people has supported structures of racism causing ongoing trauma and health inequities. By living here, working here, and using the resources of this place, we now participate in this experience. As part of the process to heal the land and community, we reflect on several questions. What are our obligations to the people who first inhabited this land? How do we figure out what our responsibilities are to this land? How can we be good stewards and guests here? How can we support existing local struggles? And how can we work together to promote the School of Nursing's vision to ensure optimal health and well-being for all people and the planet? To this end, the School of Nursing at the University of Minnesota is honored to host the first inaugural Planetary Health lectureship and welcome you to this important conversation. My name is Connie Delaney, and I am Dean of the School of Nursing. It is now my pleasure to introduce Tad Johnson. He is an enrolled member of the Voice Forte Band of Chippewa. In 2019, Tad M. Johnson was named the University of Minnesota's first Senior Director of American Indian Tribal Nations Relations. As Senior Director of American Indian Tribal Nations Relations, Johnson is housed at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. Here, he is director of the Tribal Sovereignty Institute and also director of graduate studies in the American Indian Studies Department. Welcome, Dr. Tad Johnson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Delaney. Chimigwech in Ojibwe. I just want to welcome all of our Zoom attendees on behalf of the University of Minnesota, which is deeply committed to the full inclusion of Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. This is a particularly exciting time to be at the University of Minnesota for American Indian, Alaska Native students, faculty, and staff, also First Nation folks who are here as well. My position is to go out and talk with the 11 tribes of Minnesota, and I work within the 5 campuses of the system. The university has devoted a lot of time and resources to creating some new programs with a Master of Tribal Administration and Governance and a Master of Tribal Resource and Environmental Stewardship. The Humphrey School recently started teaching a class in tribal state relations. And it seems like in virtually every school within and campus of the University of Minnesota, there is some activism going on with regard to creating new curricula on Indigenous peoples of North America and South America as well, and worldwide. And so I think the political climate in Minnesota right now, we have a Native American lieutenant governor and several members of the state legislature who are American Indians. And we have a lot of programs in health targeted towards the Native American population, both at the University of Minnesota Duluth and the Twin Cities campus and Rochester. And of course, we've got a very large student population at the University of Minnesota Morris. And I've been chatting with our friends up at the University of Minnesota Crookston, and there is activism and activities going on throughout the whole system. So this is a wonderful time to be at the University of Minnesota. And recently the president announced that she's going to add to her cabinet an advisor on American Indian issues. So that's a very exciting announcement. I'll be serving on the search committee for that person. So I can't think of a better time to be here at the University of Minnesota throughout the system, whether you're in Duluth, Morris, Rochester, Crookston, or the Twin Cities campus. So, and it's programs like this that are kind of highlighting the change, the trajectory, the movement forward that we have here at the university. So it is now my pleasure to introduce the guest scholar for the inaugural School of Nursing Planetary Health Leadership Program. So Dr. Nicole Redvers, ND, MPH, is a member of one of the great Canadian First Nations, and I'm going to allow her to pronounce it. And she has worked with various Indigenous patients and communities around the globe, helping to bridge the gap between traditional and modern medical systems. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine and the Indians into Medicine program at the University of North Dakota, a very important program for students thinking about going into the medical field. She is a co-founder and chair of the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation based in the Canadian North, with her foundation awarded a $1 million 2017 Arctic Inspiration Prize for their work with homeless people and those most at risk in Northern Canada. Dr. Redvers has been actively involved at the international level, promoting the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives in planetary health and sustainable healthcare education, or the acronym SHE, S-H-E, and is currently sitting on the advisory board for the American Indian Health Association's Center for Climate, Health, and Equity Steering Committee, and is a senior fellow of Indigenous and Community Health with In Vivo Planetary Health. She is also the author of the trade paperback book entitled The Science of the Sacred, Bridging Global Indigenous Medicine Systems and Modern Scientific Principles. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Redvers. Doctor?
Masicho, Teddy, Connie, and Tad, for your warm welcome and acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples of your community. And I want to start by also acknowledging all of those elders and ancestors, past, present, and future, wherever you are in this great landscape that we have. Now, I'm just going to share screen here. Bear with me for 1 second. I'm really, really pleased to be here today to talk about my perspectives and work within this important area that we have as a society and as a collective community around the globe. And I want to invoke the wise words of Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, who's from the eastern part of Canada. And he termed the English language version of what's called two-eyed seeing, which some of you may have heard about. And two-eyed seeing is the premise of utilizing one eye to look through the world from an Indigenous lens worldview, and using the other eye to look through the world from a Western lens, so that when you have a problem or an issue to solve or something to analyze or look into, that you're looking at that with the two eyes from both worlds coming in. And I really bring that into the work that I do and what I'm going to talk about today. It's really important to root myself of where I am, my relationality, as we talk about relation to land and the acknowledgement of where we are. I sit right now on the lands of the Ojibwe and the Oate people, but I'm originally from the Dene Ch'anie First Nation, which is part of the Dene peoples in the land of Dene, which is land of the peoples. And the Dene peoples cover a vast area over the Northwest Territories in Canada, Yukon, Northern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and have varying different languages and community cultures within them. And I'm proud to come from a line of strong elders and community members, and I really want to honor their work. And as a clinician, as a researcher, as a community member, it's really important to be in relation to my work, in relation to my culture and my greater community. It's important to locate myself in a purposeful way in order to demonstrate respect for, but also remain accountable to Salatina, or in English, all my relations, as we say. And it's important to note that my Indigenous way of being in the world, or sometimes in the Western way termed ontology, in addition to my way of applying knowledge in the world, or sometimes in the English way termed my epistemology. And also my lived experience has been informed by tens of thousands of years of memories that are stored in my region's stories. The stories are our main method and rooted directly in the lands that we come from. George Kajati aptly describes this relationship brilliantly by stating that the culture's vitality is literally dependent on individuals in community with the natural world. Indigenous cultures are an extension of the story of the natural community of a place and evolve according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. So I always must honor my ancestors and my elders, as anything I share or talk about in this world is not my knowledge. It's not my area of expertise. This is the collective knowing of a group of people that stretches thousands of years passed down through oral stories by our people. And my own Indigenous research methodologies stem from a rooted decolonized state of being that I premise on 4 R's, which has been described sometimes in the Indigenous methodological literature, including that of respect, that of relevance, that of reciprocity, and that of responsibility, with direct underpinnings and transferability to kinship relationships with all planetary elements and beings ranging from the micro level all the way up to the meta level. And this innate methodology is also exemplified by how we utilize our terminologies to demonstrate strength-based relationships to the lands and the places that we come from. For example, land with a capital L in the English language being an entity with whom we have a relationship, versus land with a small l referring to a mere geographic place. Mother Earth is a concept comparatively to her as a mother. So the conceptualization to something is very different than the relationship to something. And the strength of relationship again spans the micro to the meta. And this idea of how we formulate our relationships are rooted in a framework of knowing that prioritizes interconnectedness as a basic and fundamental natural law. So how do we turn this interconnected relationship, this interconnectedness to all entities into a methodology for research or for clinical practice? Well, of course, there has always been a methodology. There's been a scientific evidence-informed method in existence for thousands of years in how to live and know the world around us. Traditional Indigenous knowledge systems are based on sacred natural laws, which then define traditional protocols, which then give a framework for both old world and modern world ways of knowing. Yet, unfortunately, in the spirit of scientific hegemony, of scientific dominance that has often pervaded most branches of Western clinical practice, research and inquiry, our knowledge democracies have not prevailed. And this term epistemological pluralism is a complex term, and it recognizes and appreciates that in any given research or practice context, there may be several valuable ways of knowing, and that accommodating this plurality, this collective unity, can lead to a more successful integrative study and practice. Yet unfortunately, this has not been prioritized in many cases in our systems of learning or in our applications in the real world to many of the complex problems that we face today. So before we can address issues of equity in regard to any topic, we must also understand how even ways of knowing, ways of being in the world, and ways of carrying out inquiry is also steeped in consideration of social justice and the mere democracy of how we apply knowledge. And a good example of this diversity in ways of being and knowing is how we apply those considerations to applied practice, how we actually view health equity in society. From the Western perspective, we often see this figure depicted here on the slide, denoting the difference between equal and equity, with, of course, the left picture being the family having the same sized boxes, but of course, understanding that the little one is not able to see over the fence, despite, of course, having equal opportunities. And that there's a need for having equity, which means that we sometimes need to prioritize effort in certain parts of our population. But with this, from an Indigenous perspective, from a minority, from a BIPOC perspective, the question that gets asked is, why is the Brown family still outside of the fence? Why are they not in the stands with the game? Do they even want to be watching the same game in the first place? So I want to bring in the wise words of Abigail Ekohak-Pani, who's the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute out of Seattle, who's doing amazing work within this space, who says, why do we need to be considering and watching the same game in the first place? So the crumpled pile in the top left-hand corner of the screen is the stands that have been broken down. And the young lady has taken the wood from the stands and created a cradle board to carry her young child and getting back out on the land and connecting to the land in a place of self-determination. So why is there an urgent need for epistemological pluralism, this collective ways of knowing, again, that appreciates that there is not only just one different field of practice, but several ways of being and knowing in the world, and several ways of how we even define terminologies and apply them within practice? And the reality is that the world has changed. We have went from a circular and natural worldview to a square synthetic worldview. And this lens of the world affects how we create research questions, how background knowledge is retrieved and how we might operationalize it, and how we consider the hierarchy of priorities in knowledge building processes, as well as solutions to some of our greatest challenges currently on the planet, such as that of the climate crisis, but also for the current pandemic. And in my community up north in subarctic Canada, in the past and the present, we go hunting and foraging and only take the amount of caribou or moose we need, no more, no less. We used and still use every part of that animal, every part. And when we're done with the bones, the ones we haven't used, we bring them back to the land as an act of reciprocity. And all those bones need to go back to the land as part of the protocol of respect for that animal. And today, unfortunately, individuals and communities, societies often shop and buy things they merely want, not what they actually need, continuing this consuming behavior pattern rooted often originally in capitalistic colonialism. And we have been in some senses sucked up into this colonial framework of worth and domination over things, natural or non-natural, forgetting the key difference between true need, want, and desire. So the question is how do we get back to our origin? How do we decolonize ourselves and teach others the natural laws and protocols that allow for a more sustainable world? And the health effects are very clear. The land is a healing place, not just because of what it provides us, but what it gives to us in relationship. And we have forgotten this as a society. If you look carefully at these graphs, you'll notice a very clear pattern in almost every single one of them, regardless of whether or not we were talking about the trends of Earth's natural systems or socioeconomic trends in general that are relevant to our community's health. And almost all of the graphs note a clear acceleration or exponential growth after about 1950, starting with the natural Earth systems. And it's why we have seen the coin of the term, the Anthropocene, or the term of the geologic epoch in which humans have created vast changes to the world, from water use to fertilizer use to ocean acidification, to methane levels, marine fish capture, and then of course, consequent measures in things like GDP and direct investment, large dams, urban populations. So what comes to mind when you see this data in front of you? And it's, somewhat striking the clear connection between exponential socioeconomic growth with that of the destruction of Earth's systems. And as students, scholars, and practitioners, we know that data and scientific inquiry are important and serve a place in society, just like we as Indigenous people acknowledge the importance of evidence-informed ways of knowing. And we still have a crisis in many areas of our society with the rejection, the simple acknowledgement, or just the outright refusal to accept the reality of human-caused climate change. And we can see here a graph showing the carbon dioxide levels at parts per million, and you can see the clear straight line rise in CO2 levels with the last measure here from 2018 around 407.4. Clearly showing that we're not in a good spot right now. And this recent relentless rise shows a remarkable constant relationship with fossil fuel burning and can be well accounted for based on the simple premise that about 60% of the fossil fuel emissions stay in the air. And if fossil fuel burning continues at a business as usual rate, such that humanity exhausts the reserves over the next few centuries, the CO2 will continue to rise to the levels of close to 1,500 parts per million. And the atmosphere would then not be able to return to pre-industrial levels, even tens of thousands of years into the future. So I cannot emphasize how time crucial our actions are in terms of curbing some of the destruction that's happening to our mother. We have small time to make large inroads to avoid larger crises, more so than we've seen in the recent pandemic. The health impacts are already being demonstrated in my home regions of Canada, which is warming at roughly twice the global rate. And the subarctic regions of my traditional homelands have already passed the Paris Climate Agreement set at no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In fact, we're sitting at 2.3 degrees rise since 1970s, and we can see the effects of this change already. And what's, to be honest, mind-blowing, even for me, is the amount of knowledge, the amount of depth of knowledge within our Indigenous communities. I was told of prophecies by my elders on the change that was coming to the planet. I was told of a time when the ground would start collapsing on itself, being sucked into the earth. And now we see this as the permafrost is melting with climate change, the ground collapsing into itself. I was told there would be a time when the axis of the earth would move off to the side, which would start a catastrophic spin without the right things being done. And now we see NASA identifying a wobbler shift in the planet's spinning axis. And as the polar caps melt with their extreme weight, it is the shifting of the weight balance of the entire earth and its spin. And I was told of a time when there would be sickness waking up again from the ground. And now we see as the permafrost melts, long dormant bacteria and viruses are being mobilized with the possibility of reinfecting both animals and humans, as happened last year in Siberia. So we see what is called the environmental public health chiasm, meaning this stark intersection between these fields. And when we think about things, for example, like non-communicable diseases such as asthma and respiratory diseases that will be impacted by things like longer pollen seasons, for example, for allergies, or higher particulate air pollution and its relation to cardiovascular disease. When we appreciate that 6 out of every 10 infectious diseases come from animals, further exacerbated by changing habitats and living in closer proximity with them due to commercial farming and wildlife practices, as well as the clear degradation of ecosystems, it becomes hard to ignore our complete and utter interconnectedness with our mother. We have seen increasing mental health concerns in the space with a lack of exposure to nature, nature deficit, ecological grief, climate change anxiety, in addition to many of the other elements noted here that have direct relationship to us and our human-caused changes to the planet. Now, we have an ever-evolving field of various areas of knowledge, inquiry, literature, and practice. And it's important to be aware of some of these terminologies in the space broadly, because they do have slightly different meanings, different areas of focus and practice. And it does have implications for how we translate knowledge to the clinical research or practice level, who we engage with, and how we educate our communities. So in terms of some of these descriptions, again, this is very high level, not giving by any means the full appreciation of the field, but hopefully enough to be clear that different spaces of practice do currently exist. Environmental health itself is known to be the branch of public health that focuses on the relationship between people and their environment, promotes human health and well-being, and fosters healthy and safe communities. And it's a key part of any comprehensive public health framework. And we've seen this demonstrated by the American Public Health Association here within the US. So it's been historically rooted within the field of public health broadly, and it's why you see some other terms popping up that are reflective of the work being done in other spaces. Of course, acknowledging that there's other scientific disciplines also working within this area. One of the other areas that you might have heard of is the One Health, and some of the elements for One Health is in the area of zoonotic diseases, antimicrobial resistance, food safety and food security, vector-borne diseases, environmental contamination, and other health threats shared by people, animals, and the environment. And there's a large amount of co-partnership work in this area between veterinarians, scientists, and infectious disease specialists and physicians, which of course is an area made very relevant and clear by the current COVID-19 pandemic, which was a zoonotic infection. Eco-health is another burgeoning field in both the literature and practice space, with a few international organizations also working in this space. And eco-health approaches are said to be systemic participatory approaches to understanding and promoting human health and well-being in the context of complex social and ecological interactions. And eco-health has its main focus on interrelations between ecosystems specifically and human health, but also encompasses many other areas as denoted by their 6 principles, including utilizing systems thinking, transdisciplinary work, being participatory as noted, having elements of sustainable mindsets, gender and social equity, and knowledge to action. And now comes in planetary health as a relative newcomer into this space. And although conceptualizations of planetary health have been around in Indigenous communities for thousands of years, it was formally defined in the English language in the last 10 years or so. Its origins in Western applications were, to be frank, very anthropocentric or very human-centric in nature, as denoted by the definition here. Planetary health is a field focused on characterizing the human health impacts of human-caused disruptions of Earth's natural systems. And there was a clear realization, however, that everything is connected, that what we do, the world comes back to affect us, and not always in ways that we would expect. And understanding and acting upon these challenges calls for massive collaboration across disciplinary and national boundaries to safeguard our health. Now, in 2018, my colleagues and I published a reconceptualization of the concept of planetary health that embodied the need for a more holistic representation, in that it is inseparably bonded to human health, yes, defined as interdependent vitality of all the natural and anthropogenic ecosystems. But this vitality includes the biological defined ecosystems at all levels of being that favor biodiversity, and includes the more broadly defined human constructed social, political, and economic ecosystems that favor health equity and the opportunity to strive for high level wellness. And this definition does not preclude that of business ecosystems that influence sustainable and health promoting local and global commerce. So ultimately, planetary health is a field focused on characterizing the linkages between human-caused disruptions of Earth's natural systems and the resulting impacts on public health. And the field of planetary health does aim to develop and evaluate evidence-based solutions to safeguard an equitable, sustainable, and healthy world. However, there's a continued and urgent need within this space, as well as many other spaces, to prioritize, again, what we termed epistemological pluralism, that elevates and grounds greater planetary health discourse and movements with the stewardship practices, the relation building, and the innate sense of reciprocity embodied in traditional Indigenous knowledges around the globe. And I always plural traditional Indigenous knowledges to demonstrate that great diversity that we have around regions. But this is not without first and foremost Indigenous peoples. And from an Indigenous perspective, planetary health is noted is innate due to this interconnected notion of the universe that I have mentioned. However, planetary health is the closest way of thinking about this large interconnected system approach from my perspective. And I work with the term planetary health from an Indigenous perspective primarily. It's important to note that I have seen increasing appreciation and calls for inclusion of Indigenous traditional knowledges in various space. I wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case. However, the knowledge does not come without the people. Article 31 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples clearly states the rights of Indigenous peoples to maintain, protect, and control their culture and traditional ecological knowledge. However, unfortunately, these rights have not always been acknowledged. And I do have concerns that the current momentum of large global climate goals and movements will continue to promote traditional knowledge extraction that further perpetuates inequalities and discrimination of Indigenous peoples themselves. So if the world wishes to partner and work with Indigenous communities leading traditional ecological knowledge efforts, it needs to understand established international agreements, indigenously defined ethics, and be proactive in protecting intellectual property and data sovereignty rights of local Indigenous communities first and foremost. And there needs to be increasing focus on amplifying Indigenous peoples and their voices as opposed to just their knowledge alone. As again, the knowledge does not exist without the peoples themselves. And this is rarely appreciated in global circles around climate change and biodiversity loss. And the reality of the parachute researcher or even clinician is still very real today. And the term parachute researcher, sometimes helicopter researcher, is used to describe the scientist that drops out of the ivory tower into their field site, often in a less developed region of the world, extracts data and zips back to their institution to analyze and communicate the results to fellow academics without engaging the people living in the region in any meaningful way. And unfortunately, this paradigm is still far more widespread than most of us would like to admit, and it's a paradigm that needs to be continued to be challenged. And this has implications in many areas, even outside research, but is particularly relevant in the way research has often been done in Indigenous communities, minority communities, and in developing nations across the globe. And the term extraction for me is very symbolic here with this topic area, used in the symbolism with the extractive resource processes that often happen on unceded Indigenous land globally. So this taking away of something sacred to Indigenous people speaks again to the deep and often dark history that has marred Indigenous research and knowledge mining for decades. And the other piece of knowledge mining to be aware of is this concept of benefits. And we saw how conceptualizations of the term health equity can differ between worldviews. And this is also the case in terms of how we actually might define community benefits. A quote here from Bainbridge and colleagues in 2015 who summarized this just excellently. And they state that one outstanding issue to be considered when articulating an impact benefit narrative is that although there are overlapping aspects, the concept of research benefit does not translate equally across Indigenous and non-Indigenous contexts, or at the different levels at which impact is actually manifested. So traditionally, impact and therefore benefits has been measured by peer accountability in academia as opposed to social accountability, with academic productivity measures such as research income, bibliometrics, and citations taking precedence. And while academics talk about research impact, Indigenous people talk about ethical positions and tangible benefits, such as responses and solutions to issues studied in research projects that are meaningful to their lives. So when we talk about reform in these problematic areas, we see some institutions have applied a decolonizing lens to think about and implement broader Indigenous research strategies that foreground Indigenous knowledge, values, and practice. And I quote Bainbridge here again and colleagues from 2015, a decolonizing approach requires a power shift in research relations and is embedded in a social justice perspective. It entails, for instance, the privileging of Indigenous voices and epistemologies and collaborative research endeavors. And we have seen Indigenous researchers and scholars have been long seeking to reform mainstream Indigenous health scholarship and practices. And these reform agendas align with Indigenous aspirations of empowerment and self-determination. And as such, they do have emancipatory political integrity and seek to privilege Indigenous voices by recognizing Indigenous ways of knowing, ways of being, and ways of doing. So this is an opportune time to introduce a quote by a Maori woman from Otaroa by the name of Linda Tuawi Tarina Smith, who's a professor of Indigenous education at the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. And she's the author of the book Decolonizing Methodologies, Research in Indigenous People, which originally came out in 1999, followed by a second edition in 2012. And she stated that when Indigenous peoples become the researchers and not merely the research, the activity of research is transformed. Questions are framed differently, priorities are ranked differently, problems are defined differently, and people participate on different terms. And as we have come to understand the different ontologies or ways of being, and the epistemology, or again, the ways of knowing, foundational to Indigenous people's way of life and worldview, we can better appreciate the demands for its own approach to research and practice if we're going to get to a place of actually improving the health status of not only Indigenous people, but also of our planet. And there's a statement made by 60 Indigenous community members and experts who gathered to discuss climate change, traditional knowledge, and food sovereignty in Mexico in 2018 at a convening that was organized by the group Cultural Survival and the International Indian Treaty Council. And it's a great example of this understanding of the need for respectful partnership while also being firm on what partnership actually looks like from an Indigenous perspective. And they stated collectively in their report that they convened, we recognize the extreme crisis that we are facing through our Indigenous science and ways of knowing, and the realities we are living on the ground. If we agree to share this knowledge for the good of all humanity, it must be based on respect for our rights and the commitment by countries to implement real changes in their methods of production and concepts of development. And the lens of the world clearly affects how we see our innate hierarchies of ourselves over all other beings on the planet. we see here on the left this anthropocentrism, or this human-centric notion of hierarchy with humans on the top, this ego or I perspective. And then the cosmocentricism, which is denoted here by a Mayan worldview, or the eco or the we, with of course human being a part of the collective with no hierarchy involved. And health equity considerations in research and practice are thankfully becoming more common in modern discourse and conversation. And it's important to emphasize again here that health equity is defined differently in different worldviews, given the previous figure that I noted by Sister Abigail Echohawk. And what is also important, as denoted here, is this idea of interspecies equity that is seen from a place of relationality or relationship. We are all interconnected with no hierarchy between us when it comes to how the natural systems operate in the world. And I talk about equity from many different lenses. On the previous slide, interspecies equity was highlighted previously in terms of the human construct of health equity. However, we also have to understand notions of intergenerational equity, which is a prime consideration for many Indigenous communities, often making decisions based on the effects on the next 7 generations to come. We've been mortgaging the health of future generations to realize economic and development gains in the present, as noted by the Lancet Commission on Planetary Health. So what is the largest takeaway when it comes to connecting equity and needed forward steps is understanding clearly that the root causes and upstream drivers of climate change and health inequities are often the same. And I want to highlight that the root causes and upstream drivers of climate change and health inequities are often the same. The health risks and impacts of climate change are not equally or fairly distributed across people, communities, or nations, and climate change has the potential to exacerbate existing health and social inequities. But in terms of forward steps, the good news is that interventions that act on upstream shared systemic causes can most effectively address both climate change and health inequities. And of course, building political and economic power and voice are essential components of climate resilience. Again, our interconnectedness has no limits and is defined all the way from the micro to the meta levels of our existence, and how we consider some of these interventions will depend on our worldview. This interconnected nature is also depicted by this figure here on the slide. We are unified communities due to our interconnectedness on all fields of structure and influence. Yet there is also a clear interrelationship with repercussions for not living in balance with the planet, as Earth-centered jurisprudence systems govern both natural and global systems, which means there is a unity of natural laws between us. The sun will continue to rise from the east and set in the west. The moons will continue to affect the tides, but Mother Earth will also respond to our interactions with her, which ultimately affects all other life forms. We are nested into an interconnected relationship with other innate and applied knowledges, which then impact the health of our communities and ecosystems. So this bi-directional impact of various nested levels is incredibly important as we help to form our reality, just as much as we were bound by some of these constants. And of course, given the bi-directional potential for effects noted here with the arrows, if we go from the center of this figure outwards, we as people can, of course, negatively impact our planet by the choices that we make. For example, using too much fossil fuels, and therefore the people that hold key knowledges will be impacted and those knowledges lost. For example, by mining for fossil fuels or minerals on traditional lands, Indigenous peoples lose connection to their source. And this means that Mother Earth will be forced to rebalance herself due to the realities of what are called natural laws. And this ultimately comes back on us when we can no longer thrive on the planet. So in the vision for a healthy future, it's important to create the conditions that enable the overcoming of the dissonance between being in nature, so nature which simply surrounds us, and being of nature, nature that embodies us. And I want to share a statement that one of my colleagues and sisters from Western Australia, Anne Paulina states, and she states that, you know, Earth will be able to balance herself. Earth knows what to do. However, without humans, she will be missing the human vibration. And this element of it, there is this importance of us being in this collective planet. However, recognizing our responsibility in it ensures, of course, that we can take care of her as much as she can take care of us. So ultimately, what we call natural or first law is the way of living on land or country handed down through countless generations. And these laws differ in terms of how they're described depending on the indigenous nation around the world. A natural law or first law sustains a web of relationships between the human and non-human world and forms a pattern which is life itself. And this pattern must be recreated and the law followed to sustain life. So indigenous traditional knowledges are directly nested within understandings of natural or first law, whose meaning, of course, is uniquely rooted within the respective lands globally. And this is one of the largest mistakes, is to be able to homogenize indigenous traditional knowledge as if it is one entity. But indigenous traditional knowledges and ecological knowledges are deeply interconnected with the land in which it arises. I want to share a quote by Elder David Kushiri, who's from the Nagani of the Anishinaabe Nation. And he stated that working in alliance with nature and her natural laws is the key to ensuring our survival. And the reason we have climate change is because we have broken natural law. So what is natural law and how can we find our balance again? The spirit in each of our beings carries moral and ethical principles of what should be the basis of our human conduct. We understand these moral principles as natural laws. Natural laws are innate to all living beings. They are the invisible laws that govern all life. All living beings, including Mother Earth herself, are governed by natural laws, whether they know it or not. So the title for this talk included the concept of Dene Ch'anie, which encapsulates my Dene people's way of life and essentially means the path we walk. And the Denechanya philosophy emphasizes an ecological perspective rather than one of only humans. And my Dene elder, Francois Paulette, who teaches on this concept, often states that our life is one of billions that cohabit our earth. Yet each living being has an ethereal flow of existence, a spirit, and spirits take form from the action trails they leave behind, and their beliefs create projections into the future. Interactions with other living beings creates these knots of existence in what we call the spirit world. And from a distance, looking from a distance, the many intersecting and solo paths with these little knots resembles somewhat of a cobweb. So for our spirit to live in harmony with others, we must appreciate these internal laws of existence, this interconnectedness. The cobweb is one. However, a harmonious life does not only mean living in harmony with others, it also requires to live a balanced life. And from the Dene Ch'anie, Elder Francois explains how the balance of the mind, body, emotion, and spirit help us lead a balanced life. Our life is a balancing act, and sometimes it is suffering itself that helps us to come to terms with our place in the Dene Ch'anie. So with this, the Dene Ch'anie, or the path we walk as humans, is fluid. We need to ensure the path we walk is engendered by our commitment to wellness, not only for people and communities, but for the planet as well. We need to intimately understand that our collective work must be foundationed on the important notion of reciprocity with the planet and all her beings, and this spans from the micro level to the meta level without hierarchy. And ultimately, as Terry Tiji, a member of the Takla First Nation, stated, "Take care of the land, and the land will take care of you." I come from the Dene peoples of Northern Canada, from the land called Dene Day, as I noted, or land of the people. And if we break down the word Dene in one of the Dene languages, in which there are many as noted, we see that De means flow, and ne means land, flowing from the land. Dene, flowing from the land. The Dene have a relationship with the land. Their very being flows from the land, and the land from its people. The concept of flowing from the land roots the Dene in their landscape and creates the culture, and as such, the teachings about the land serve as the essence of their being. There's no separation from the land, and when there is, dysfunction arises. So the terminology of my peoples literally is from the land. So with this, I always like to ask questions of, where are you rooted? How is your interconnected narrative fulfilled? How will you move forward as a steward and a relative of the planet and all other living entities? How will you take notice of the importance of epistemological pluralism in research and practice? How will you elevate the Indigenous knowledge holders and voices in your respective regions or institutions? And with this, it's also important to take note of some of the active steps we can take moving forward in this work, recognizing also the importance of self-care and the need for our own wellness to find purpose in the work that we do. And I personally find the taking action piece of this figure incredibly helpful. But these other points can be incredibly important and helpful to keep in mind, especially given the state of our world currently with the pandemic. And whether it's fostering a stronger connection with nature, getting education, taking action, getting active, but also knowing when to disengage and take a break when needed. And in addition to my taking action with the areas of planetary health, I'm happy to say that the field of Indigenous health is flourishing, with the University of North Dakota being the first institute in North America to have a PhD in Indigenous health program. And one of the reasons why I moved very far away from my homelands to be not far from where your institution is, about a 5-hour drive away. It took me a lot to leave my home, but the importance of elevating the voices in young people in regards to Indigenous health is incredibly important in my mind. And I hope to see more and more of our people contributing to the dialogue, but also more spaces opening up to help elevate Indigenous people's voices around these important topics discussed here today. And I want to highlight, in a paper published with global Indigenous colleagues last year, we highlighted how important opportunity is to developing the field of education for sustainable healthcare in particular. But of course, this crosses all fields and domain. And we had highlighted as a group 9 formal action and process-oriented recommendations for health professional institutions, educators, and health research systems, with the goal of increasing the pluralism of knowledge systems in healthcare practice in the context of global environmental change and sustainable healthcare education. And the recommendations are predicated on the importance of increasing Indigenous presence and leadership in environmentally sustainable healthcare education, as well as health professional education at large. Given the colonial legacy, Indigenous people, despite their essential knowledge systems and abilities, still face many barriers in terms of access to safe spaces and presence, but also in the ability to take on active leadership roles in academic and clinical spaces. So I'm very happy to hear of the important work, as Dr. Johnson was mentioned, at the University of University of Minnesota. So the 9 action and process-oriented needs, although focused on health professions education that we developed, really applies to all disciplines within academia. And I want to acknowledge all of the beautiful faces from many different areas of the world that contributed to this work. And these 9 points are important and actionable. And I would like to take a moment to read them out here because I think they're important. And they are that to value the inherent and often uncomfortable tensions that can be felt while walking through difficult historical truths, as by acknowledging these truths, such as the continued marginalization of Indigenous people, the path to health equity for all on the planet is more likely to be attained. Understand and better acknowledge the patterns of privilege in current health professions education, planetary health movements, and sustainable healthcare education landscapes, including the recognition that colonization is a fundamental determinant of Indigenous peoples' health. Prioritize and increase the intake of Indigenous students at health professions institutions through active support of institutional pathway programs and admittance support starting in grade school. Prioritize and increase the appointment of Indigenous faculty and leadership in health professions institutions globally, including mobilization of sufficient funds to do so. Prioritize and actively support direct Indigenous involvement at local, national, and global scales in environmentally sustainable work, as well as in research opportunities and grants in the area. Centralize Indigenous-led land and country-based understanding of health and well-being into health professions education curricula through supporting and expanding institutional and Indigenous leadership. Prioritize cultural safety training integration in all professional education and medical systems, including active and ongoing reconciliation work with Indigenous healing and medical systems. And lastly, transform education for sustainable healthcare frameworks to include an Indigenous-led planetary and ecosystems-based applied practice lens into the operationalization of health professions education sustainability curriculi. There's been calls around the planet for elevating Indigenous knowledge. And again, I want to take this time to emphasize that we do not have the knowledge without Indigenous peoples. And by providing the spaces and the opportunities to share those voices, we have collective hope together as one. So I'd like to end today with this quote from one of my dear sisters' research on land-based healing, in which one of the elders shared that land-based is one of those words. It's a beautiful, wonderful term. It's bringing people back to the land and helping them become alive and remembering their humanity and their connection to all living things. We are the land. So if we remember who we are, then the same miracle that we see all around us will be us. So I'd like to end now and remind us about Dene Ch'anie and how it reminds us to walk in the world in a good way. The path we hopefully decide to walk is together with Mother Earth as our relative. And I want to say Masi Cho Cho, big thank you for your time and attention today. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you in presence to talk about some of these topics. And they're deep and vast topics, so I hope this brief introduction will stimulate thought and consideration as you go forward with your own journeys. And I will note additionally that I do share quite a bit of resources and publications on my professional Twitter or Facebook page noted here. So feel free to pop on if you're interested in this area knowledge practice. And I try to elevate Indigenous voices as much as possible. Masi Cho again, and I welcome any questions, comments, or discussions at this time. I believe Teddy will be helping out with this process, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing screen here. Masi Cho.
Dr. Redvers, I don't know where to begin to thank you for this incredible presentation, for your excellent scholarship and your obvious leadership globally in advancing the healing of our relationships. Nursing, our profession, is a relationship-based profession. So I appreciate deeply as a nurse hearing that threaded through your entire conversation. Several of the questions acknowledged a place that we now find ourselves in Minnesota, and that is we have a new pipeline being built across, a replacement pipeline being built across northern Minnesota to carry tar sands down from Canada. And we are aware that there are obvious threats to Indigenous people of northern Minnesota, to their health, to the land, and to the culture. And so the question that I can summarize all the ones that came in around this was what's the unique role of universities in working towards respecting and protecting future generations?
I think that's a wonderful and such an important topic that we don't talk about enough. We talk about the roles of health systems often, and we've seen a lot of leadership in health systems, even hospitals in some instances standing up for their own goals of reaching net carbon zero, for example, by periods of time, or signing on to ensure the sustainability. But we don't often see this from educational institutions. And to be frank, I only know a handful that have signed on to this. I know Stanford's been doing quite a bit of work in this area, as well as a few others. I think we have a huge responsibility, because if we're educating young people to be our future, if there is no future, then what are we doing in terms of that process? And imagining this is a very political and politically sensitive topic, especially when institutions are receiving funding from governments who have a delicate balance between economic needs of their communities. So, there's no easy answer to this, but I hope to see a greater responsibility for institutions, knowing that we are on the cliff edge right now. We do not have the opportunity to not have this conversation. It is incredibly important for institutions to start thinking about these difficult questions now and not 10 years from now.
Thank you very much. And it is complex, but it's going to require all of us having very honest and transparent dialogues about how we work on these issues and how we preserve the future generations, as I said, especially for land grant institutions such as the University of Minnesota. That's our obligation to be serving future generations. There was also a question that's asked about if you can talk about the 3 to 5 root causes or drivers for health inequity and climate change. And we know that there's many, but if you want to touch upon ones that are particularly concerning to you from an Indigenous peoples perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a wonderful paper that was done many years ago now that was talking about the indigenous determinants of health. And they divided the determinants into 3 levels: proximal, intermediate, and distal. And one of the important things with that was separating out some of the immediate determinants of health that are sort of prominent in many communities, behavioral health, some of the socioeconomic structures and those types of things. But what was unique and important in regards to the Indigenous concept was an additional level of hierarchy that's considered with determinants, and that is of racism, of structural inequities, of colonialism, and some of these pieces in place. And that is the sphere of influence for me that translates directly to some of these other issues of environmental inequities. It is very clear in terms of the governance, economic systems, and law that exist today that we put and continually put humans above all else, where we value a tree only when it's cut down. That's where these are difficult conversations, but that mindset, and from an Indigenous perspectives, I say colonial, not to make people feel bad. My colleague, Dr. Donald Warren, who's amazing, and he always says, if we want to get to true equity, we need to walk through truth. And these are difficult conversations to have, but these mindsets that pervaded our lands took over a mindset that was collective, that de-hierarchical, that had this aspect of relationship to it. So ultimately, by dealing with some of these structural elements, the racism, the colonialism pieces that comes into society, those are the overlaps for me that I relate to as an Indigenous person to some of the other health disparities.
Wonderful, thank you very much. One of the comments here is, it reminds me of how important it is to remember and reconnect with ourselves and all beings, finding our balance in it all again. And I know you and I have been working on the Planetary Health Framework for Education that is supposed to be coming out this spring. And we served on the subcommittee that worked with nature, and you and I pushed very hard to transform it from humans and nature to interconnection within nature. Could you help flesh that out a little bit? Because that's an important mind shift that I think we all have to make from being separate, nature is something that we look at, study, measure, etc., to being in nature.
Absolutely. And hopefully some of those quotes resonated from the elders that I'd shared in my presentation, because they really emphasize from that worldview about how there is no separation. And we can even think about this on a molecular scale from a scientific perspective, that if we continually go down and divide ourselves from, this physical being to our bones and tissues, to cells, to organelles, to, all the way down to atomic particles, we are all the same when we get down to the gist of it. We are all the same matter. We're not different in any way. So whether you think of it from that perspective or from the relational aspect, what a joy to have a tree as a relative in your yard. What a joy to have that rabbit that's nearby as a relative, as a relation to you. They're embodied in you. You look at things different. You treat things differently. And it's why we see the research being very clear that those that have more interconnection within nature are more likely to engage in ecological positive actions.
So there's a lot of questions here about how we begin to move back towards a collectivist view away from the individualized view. And one person said, in our short-sighted capitalist mainstream American society, what do you see as effective means by which to bring awareness to the fundamental importance of the natural law for the benefit of the individual and the collective?
Definitely. Well, number one is education, because, these, frankly, unfortunately, are late conversations that we're having. And, natural law went underground for a long time because of the subjugation policies within American, but also in Canadian history from where I'm from. My mother and my grandmother were both boarding school survivors. They were taken from their families and told basically under the policy of kill the Indian and save the man. So a lot of these teachings, were not coming out into communities. And that's why I solely prioritize the importance of Indigenous presence in spaces, because we need people to be out there talking and teaching in these ways so that people can start to hear different viewpoints that are out there. The second piece that's important for me is love. And this translates every religion in the world. It translates every culture within the world. There's none that do not have some element of love in that. And we don't talk about love enough. We shy away from it. And by giving and engaging love, my elders have been so amazing in that regard, the examples that they give when they've gotten pushback from community, whether or not it's, standing up against environmental actions or otherwise, and just the love that they embody to people that don't agree with them. Yes. It's amazing to see that switch that happens in people that are in those circles, and often will come back and say, I'm sorry I treated you that way. To see those examples of people that do that in action, that love no matter what, the potential for that teaching is just, there's no limits to it.
That's exactly right. And I can't think of a better way to end on that note, our question time, because that is what it's about. And that's the type of relationship that is the most powerful and transformative. I would like to particularly take a moment to highlight Dr. Redvers' book, The Science of the Sacred, Bridging Global Indigenous Medicine Systems and Modern Scientific Principles. It's an incredible book, and it is moves us forward again with all the topics that she has addressed today, and does a deeper dive into helping us understand how the Indigenous healing systems and medical systems are very, very in line with what we're doing today, and share a similar story and a similar pattern. And by having that two-eyed seeing that you mentioned in the beginning, we'll all benefit from that. At this point in time, I would like to turn to Raul Aguilar from the Circle of Indigenous Nations. Raul Aguilar is the enrolled tribal member of the Red Lake Nation. He is currently serving as the senior coordinator of the Circle of Indigenous Nations Student Services Office here at the University of Minnesota. He currently serves as the president of the Minnesota Association of Counselors of Color, a nonprofit organization that focuses on college access and scholarship opportunities for underrepresented students for the state of Minnesota. And he will close out our session with a gift.
Thank you, Teddy. And I want to say miigwech to Dr. Redvers. So much of this brought back so many memories. I grew up on the Lakota Reservation in Hayward, Wisconsin, and I grew up with my grandparents too. And my grandmother taught us a lot of traditional teachings from her tribe and her youth. And this brought back so many memories. I actually got so many goosebumps from just listening to the stories and just the way of connecting nature. And in a quote there that reminded me of her so much was the take care of the land will take care of you, I believe you said, right? Or somewhere along the lines. My grandmother used to tell me that a lot when we were doing sugar bushing. So we had our own family sugar bush, and she started us out at like age 5, 6, taking us out there, collecting sap and teaching us all the ways of traditional activities and cultures that we did. And she talked a lot about how she had to, relearn all of those healings and teachings herself, then creating an immersion school for our tribe of Ojibwe language and teaching little ones, and then bringing those little ones out there. And then us still, even at little ones, we're teaching our peers at the same age. And those were always the remembrance. And just that activism and collectivism of getting our community together to learn traditional practices was such huge. So this session reminded me so much of it. So I appreciate you sharing your experiences, your knowledge with us. Every time we host a speaker in our office, we like to present them with a gift. And usually we do that in person. And so we want to thank you so much for taking the time. There's some goodies in here, even a handmade goodie. And we will be sending this over to you shortly after this. So then that way, this is you from all of us here at the University of Minnesota to say thank you for your time, your wisdom, your knowledge, and just connecting with all of us. I know I have a student on here who is really even looking forward to listening to you, a first-year student, and they're just looking to get activated. Be involved and wanting to learn more. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you, Teddy, for welcoming Dr. Redvers and everybody here. So
Masicho.
Thank you. And thank you to all who were able to attend today. I hope you will share at least one thing that you learned with people beside you, because that's how we're going to create the change that we hope will happen. This recording will be captioned, and once it's ready, it'll be on the School of Nursing website under the Planetary Health link. And so please join us. And I look forward to having you join us for future experiences around planetary health. Thank you, Dr. Redfers.